What's going on, everybody? Gareth here, FC Bureau. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today we're going to be replacing a water pump, a thermostat, and the Mickey Mouse hose flange on this 328i X-Drive behind us. This, of course, is an N20 car. This is going to be the same process for any N20, N26 vehicle. Pretty straightforward. Reason why you'd want to replace the water pump is generally you're going to have a 2E81, 2E82, or 2E85 fault code stored in the DME, which pretty much shows either under voltage or over voltage, indicating you have a problem with the water pump. Generally, it's the electronic control module inside that goes bad. Unfortunately, that's not serviceable on its own, so you do have to replace the entire water pump. While you're in there, you should also replace the thermostat. Obviously, you want to have some antifreeze. You're going to have to refill the cooling system after that. And while we're in there, we have the opportunity to replace the weak plastic flange with this aluminum upgrade. So with that said, let's talk about some of the tools we're going to need to do this job. Really, you don't need that many tools for this job. They're all pretty straightforward. We do have a couple specialty tools over here. U-View Airlift, which is a vacuum filler. Or you could also use one of these cheap no-spill funnels for helping fill and bleed out the cooling system. But really, the main tools used in this video, or we're going to use, a handful of different picks, a hose pick, some of these flexible hose clamp drivers, these spring clamp style hose clamp pliers, a couple different size ratchets, 3/8 and 1/4, different length extensions, a T30 socket, a universal 3/8, 8mm and a 13mm, primarily for the splash shields underneath the car, E12, which is going to be for the water pump bolts, and they used a 6mm 1/4-inch drive socket for some of the hose clamps or the worm style hose clamps. So pretty straightforward. You don't really need any crazy tools for this job. Our first step is going to be removing this air intake. This is obviously an aftermarket, it's cold air intake. However, removing the factory air box is pretty similar. You have your map sensor connector, you have the box that physically needs to be removed, and you have a coupler that goes to the turbo. So we need to get this out of the way because our thermostat is mounted basically right here, and the water pump is slightly below that. So we do want to gain access to the top in order to do this job. There we go. First and foremost, we have this little vacuum line that's attached to the nipple on this intake. We're gonna go ahead and put that off to the side. Next, we have our connector for this map sensor. There it is. There's a little release right here that you have to press on. Unfortunately, it's on the underside, so you can't see it. We just kind of have to feel for it. Our air box is held on these two grommets, so it's just a matter of sliding the mounting tabs off, like so. And lastly, we have two hose clamps that hold it to the suction boot, which goes to the turbo. We have to release those, and then we can pull the whole air box out. And there we go. You do have this little air duct over here, the inlet, which goes to the bottom of this air box here. This is going to be very similar to how the factory air box is. So it's just a matter of getting it released from here, the two mounting tabs, and this little adapter down here. All right, next up, we're going to go ahead and remove the splash shield from under the car. It's held on by a bunch of 8mm self-tapping screws. So I'm just going to go ahead and zip these off. The N20 setup is a little, well, N20, N26 setup is going to be the same. This particular engine is an N26, so it's a Surev engine, but that's not really going to change the layout of anything that's going on here. The water pump is the lowest point in the cooling system. You can see your upper rear hose here and your lower rear hose here, and the water pump is all the way down there. So to drain the system and get as much coolant out as possible, you actually have to drain it from the inlet of the water pump. So it's going to be kind of messy, but before we can go ahead and drain it, we need to loosen up the 6mm hose clamp that secures the inlet of the water pump. So I'm just going to go down there with a little ratchet and a 6mm and loosen up this hose clamp. Unfortunately, there is no drain plug on the radiator, so this is what you have to do. Put the car back up in the air, get the catch underneath, and avoid getting rained on. Before we do that, we're going to release system pressure by removing the expansion tank. Obviously do this when the car is cooled down. You don't want to do this when it's hot because coolant will shoot out and you will get burned. In BMW TIS instructions, all it says is simply remove that clamp, pull the hose off, and let the system drain. However, on this X-Drive car, there's also this reinforcement plate on the subframe. What I see potentially happening here is where the location of the water pump is, just a whole bunch of coolant pooling on this reinforcement plate and just making an even bigger mess. So I'm gonna remove it. I don't think you have to do this on a rear-wheel drive car, but just the shape of the subframe plus the reinforcement plate. This is gonna be a huge collection area. So it's a bunch of 13mm fasteners. Just gonna go ahead and remove it and hopefully contain the mess as much as possible. Remove the reinforcement plate. Now we have this area behind wide open. So any coolant that could potentially pool up there is just gonna fall in the catch. And now I just need to yank off this hose. Whatever you do, try not to be underneath it directly. A lot of people are gonna tell you that coolant tastes sweet. It does not. I can confirm 100% it is the nastiest thing, one of the nastiest things you'll ever taste. It has bittering agents in it, but you don't wanna consume it anyway. So stay back and give her a nice firm yank. Our next step is going to be removing the hose clamp for this upper hose on the water pump. I'm going to use one of these flexible hose clamp drivers. It's a 6mm. These things are super useful in tight spaces like this. And we're going to loosen the hose clamp so that it is loose from the hose. And I'm using a small angled pick here to try to break the seal. So to give a little bit more access, I'm going to remove the breather hose that comes down here from the inlet pipe to the turbo to the valve cover. You don't technically need to remove it to do this, but I'm going to do it just to get a little more access to the thermostat and just kind of open up the front of the engine here a little bit. So this is just kind of held on with these plastic tabs, and you want to walk it off without breaking it. So you want to make sure that those tabs are off, and there's an O-ring that seals this, so I'm just going to take a pick and just sort of get it under there and try to get the O-ring to get past its seat, and it should just come off. Like I said, you want to be careful with this because it is plastic. It can break. There we go. There it is. Have this little connector down here for the PCV heater. Same thing, just little lock tab on that. And then this portion down here, you want to depress the tabs. And once those are depressed, you should be able to walk it up out of this housing. There we go. If you see oil in here, that's fine. It's not a huge deal. There's always gonna be a little bit of oil in the inlet pipe and also in the breather line. This is taking vapor from the crankcase and it's bringing it into this suction pipe here. This goes to the turbo, so a little bit of oil is expected. Next step, we're gonna move the lower radiator hose right here from the thermostat. Pretty common BMW type of hose connection. It's just a quick disconnect, so there's an O-ring inside this fitting that goes over a little nipple here on the thermostat, and this lock ring secures it in place. These can be kind of tricky to remove because the O-ring is what creates the seal. So as you're pulling it off, the O-ring technically gets compressed, so you have to fight that. You want to pull on it evenly. You don't want to go side to side with it too much because you could break the fitting. So more coolant. But you can see how much force that required. I actually had to pull from the other side and try to just pull it straight. It eventually did come. O-ring sits right here. And like I said, there's an O-ring inside this fitting. And it's the O-ring that creates that seal. So next up, we're gonna take these spring clamps off. You will benefit to have a special tool for that. There we go. We have another one down here. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to use the hose pick and just break the seal of the rubber to the thermostat. Okay, there we go. Since we're going to replace this plastic flange with this aluminum one, I'm actually just going to remove the hose attached to the thermostat, and I'll move the thermostat off the car. Already moved the clamp, so that's pre-done. It's a little bit easier while it's still in the car. And I'm going to go to reinstall the hose. I'll make sure it's reinstalled and the clamp goes back on, but I'm just going to remove it with the fitting from the cylinder head. These are held on with T30 screws, only 2. Now, you know, like I said earlier, this is a really good time to replace this flange. More often than not, it's the flange that's going to fail, not the hose. We have a video that one of my colleagues did earlier in the year where we were stuck on the side of the road because this flange failed catastrophically on it.
It's made of just a terrible plastic, and it'll leave you on the side of the road here. So, we're going to show you how to replace it in this video. This is the old one. As you can see, it has made itself into several pieces, spilling coolant everywhere.
I'm going to remove this vacuum line here just to get it out of the way. Give myself a little bit better access. I'm going to remove this electrical connector. This is a temperature sensor for the thermostat. There we go. Put that off to the side. And then the thermostat itself is held on with 2 T30 screws, which are barely visible, kind of down there. And lastly, we're going to go ahead and remove this flange here from the cylinder head. Same thing, sealed with an O-ring, so the O-ring is going to be slightly compressed, which makes removal a little bit of a challenge. Taking this 90-degree pick and getting it in behind on one side, and I'm going to use another pick on the other side to sort of evenly compress it and walk it off. There we go. We removed it without it breaking. That's always the key. So the water pump is held on with 3 E12 Torx bolts. They shouldn't be torqued that tightly. There's 1 at the top, there's 2 at the bottom. Also, while I'm here, before this thing is loose, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the electrical connector. It's 1 depressed tab, and just pull it up. That's a satisfying sound, I love it. And there we go. There's our water pump. Kind of had to fish it up towards the center where the subframe is, and then just pull it up from the top. Here's a new water pump. This is a Pierburg OE part. Pierburg is the OE supplier for this water pump for this application. The only variant of this pump is for the F30 320i's, which is the super low output version of the N20. It has its own water pump, but for every other N20, N26 engine, uses the same water pump. Comes with these caps, which obviously just kind of hold it off. Interesting fact, if you were to reuse the water pump that you remove from the vehicle, BMW wants you to pre-fill the water pump with coolant. I'm assuming to prevent some kind of dry start. I'm not really 100% sure why that's the case. When you're installing a new water pump, that doesn't matter. But either way, the orientation of the pump is basically like this. So to get it into position, we're gonna have to feed it down from the top and then kind of walk it back towards the mounting point on the engine block. So we're gonna just sort of place it down there on the subframe, and we're gonna raise the car back up and get the bolts on. To work the water pump into position, I'm sure more antifreeze will probably drip at some point from somewhere, you know, because why not? Want to make sure the connector is not out of position. So I'm going to try to start that upper bolt by hand. Just get a couple threads going to sort of support the pump. You don't want to tighten the bolt down all the way. You just want to get it started. Once that's started, we'll go ahead and put the 2 lower bolts in. So lining up the water pump is technically, well, should be pretty straightforward. It's only 3 bolt holes. However, one thing you might run into is seeing the bushing inserts into the water pump floating around and moving and causing some misalignment with the water pump. Best thing you can do is put 1 bolt in at a time, get the thread started, and then slowly tightening down at all 3 corners. The bolts do not sit flush to the flange on the pump. They are supposed to be above because there's a metal insert inside there. Basically, the point of the rubber inserts there is to provide some type of cushioning since it is bolted direct on the engine. So you might have some issues lining it up. Just be patient. Once the 3 bolts are in, tighten them down. There's a torque spec for this. Realistically, on this application, you're not getting a torque wrench in there. So really, it's pretty low torque spec. But these are 15 Newton meters, so really not much to go by. Tightening it with a ratchet, you're gonna be perfectly within that window. This hoses should go back on pretty easy. If you're finding yourself having a hard time, you can take a little bit of antifreeze, coat the inside of the hose, and it should slip in. Go ahead and start tightening down these hose clamps. Next up, we're going to go ahead and loosely install our thermostat. I want to get both screws started. Remember, these are the T30s. Having a really long T30 socket like this does help. And once you have those screws started, you can just go ahead and tighten both those screws down. So just go ahead and slip on our thermostat hose here. Want to try to put the hose clamp back in a similar position to where it came off. Before you ever reinstall these hoses, make sure that the O-ring inside is still in good condition. If you see the O-ring is split or it's torn, this will never reseal. I'm going to take a little bit of the antifreeze that's still inside, and we're going to use that as lubrication. There's actually quite a bit of antifreeze still in there somehow. Use that as lubrication to push the hose back on. You'll feel the O-ring compress and slide into place. Once it's in place, you want to drop the lock tab in. That locks the hose in place, and you're good to go from that point. If you're confused about which connector is for the PCV heater and which one is for the thermostat, you'll notice that they are keyed differently. So the notch is different. The notch on this is offset, so you can only put the connector back into the component it's designed for. Somebody was smart when they did that design. Go ahead and click this hose back in place. And all that we really need to do at this point is we need to replace this last hose here. Like I said, we're going to replace the flange, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Went ahead, put the aluminum flange on from Ryan. It's a direct replacement for the factory piece. And all you have to do right now is just kind of orient everything. Put some antifreeze on the O-ring to help with installation. Should just go in. Install these T30 screws back into the cylinder head. Our general theory on this particular cooling hose flange is anytime you're doing a oil filter housing gasket or replacing your water pump, now is the best time to go ahead and replace this flange. Like I said, the hose itself, usually not the problem. If the hose is soft and pliable and it bends and there's no internal collapsing or anything like that, you can reuse the hose. But it's always going to be the plastic flange at the cylinder head that's going to be your long-term liability. So, makes sense to do it with the cooling system open, and then 2 times you're going to be having the cooling system open near this flange is, basically doing a water pump replacement or a cylinder head or a oil filter housing gasket replacement, which is up here at the cylinder head. Now don't worry about the torque spec on these bolts too much because it's the O-ring that seals it, so as long as the bolts are bottomed out, as long as the flange is sitting flush at the cylinder head, you're good. And we're just going to move these hose clamps back into position. And next we're going to go ahead and reinstall our PCV hose. go ahead and reinstall the PCV valve heater there. And really the last thing we need to do in the engine bay is reinstall our air box. But before we do that, now is a really good opportunity to refill the cooling system. And we also need to bleed it out, which is all done electronically on this car. But I'm gonna use a vacuum filler to refill the cooling system. So remove any air in the system, refill the cooling system with coolant, and then we're gonna use the vehicle's automatic self-bleeding system to turn the water pump on, circulate coolant, and that'll be the final bleeding procedure. We're using the UView airlift to pull air from the system. So what we're doing is we're pulling vacuum on the entire cooling system. You can see the hoses collapsing. This is going to check for any leaks. If the system can't hold a vacuum, it certainly can't hold pressure. So we're just pulling a vacuum here. We got about 25 inches of vacuum. And we're going to let it sit and make sure that it maintains a vacuum. And then we'll go ahead and vacuum fill it. Walked away to make our BMW blue drink, which is BMW genuine antifreeze. It's 50-50 mix ratio, so we have 2 gallons of antifreeze here, 2 gallons of coolant. Still holding 25 inches of vacuum through all that time. So we can be pretty sure that the cooling system is sealed and there's no leaks, which is why this tool is useful. The coolant, and gonna go ahead and open up our valve, and magic happens. This car is self-bleeding, so technically you could just fill the cooling system at the expansion tank and then run the self-bleeding procedure, which takes about 10 minutes. We're still gonna do that anyway, because that'll help push out any possible airlock that's there. Yeah, if you have one of these tools, this is really nice for checking to make sure that the system is sealed. Now I'm gonna do the vehicle self-bleeding procedure. So I'm gonna turn the car on into accessory mode. Do not start the engine. So 2 taps on the start button. You're gonna turn the heat on the highest setting, the fan at the lowest setting. And then from that point, you hold the accelerator pedal down for 10 seconds and it'll turn the water pump on. And it also opens up the thermostat. That will essentially bleed the rest of the cooling system out if there happens to be any air in it. There definitely isn't after we did the vacuum fill. But since the car has its self-bleeding procedure and it can do it itself, might as well use what's available to us. So go ahead and turn it on. So I can hear that coolant is circulating through the cooling system. It's going to take about 8 to 10 minutes. BMW says that you should have a battery maintainer on the battery while doing this, but if the battery's in good condition, you should have no problem.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
So after running the self-bleeding procedure, which took about 8 to 10 minutes, the coolant levels actually dropped a little bit in the expansion tank. So I think we might have removed a little bit of air that was still in the system. But like I said, with the vacuum bleeding, you know, if the system can maintain a vacuum for an extended period of time, that means the system is sealed and you don't really have to worry about it. So it's worth doing anyway, just as a double check. If you wanted to bleed the cooling system further, you could crack the bleeder screw here on the lower radiator hose at the thermostat housing, and you could also crack the bleeder screw here at the expansion tank. But realistically speaking, if you vacuum fill and then you do the self-bleeding procedure, you're gonna be good to go. You don't really need to worry about it. We'll go ahead and put our air intake back in. Key here, we're gonna line it up here on the right-hand side and get this lower duct into the opening in the air box. We have the vacuum line that needs to go back on. There we go. And lastly, we have our map sensor. Just clicks in. And really at this point, all we gotta do is just go underneath and put all the splash shield and the reinforcement plate back on. So you can see it's not that difficult of a job to go and replace the water pump and the thermostat on your N20 or N26 powered car. Only trick is going to be getting the water pump mounted to the engine block. The rubber mounts on the water pump can make it kind of difficult to get lined up. But aside from that, it's just a matter of being careful when you're removing the hoses and making sure you don't break any of the plastic couplers. Other than that, super straightforward process. Obviously having the UV airlift to suck air out of the system and vacuum bleed it makes it a little bit easier. And also the built-in bleeding process that BMW has on these external water pump cars also makes it extremely easy. So really doing this at home, don't really need any special tools. It's pretty straightforward. You can definitely get it done in an afternoon or even a morning. So anyway, as always, if you have any questions or comment, leave it in the comment box below. Make sure we get back to you. If you like this video, hit that like button and hit subscribe. A lot more videos on the way, so you'll definitely want to be on the watch out for that. But other than that, we'll see you for the next one. Later.